Let's get one thing straight. You were never ordinary. From the moment you stepped into this world, there was something different about you. The way you move, the way you think, the way you stand out when others try to blend in. Some people sensed it, some admired it, and some, they feared it. Because power, true power, doesn't have to announce itself. It just exists, and that's why they gathered. In dark corners, behind closed doors, whispering your name like it was some kind of threat. They thought, if they schemed hard enough, if they plotted long enough, they could rewrite the script of your destiny. They believed their jealousy, their deception, their carefully laid out plans could break you. But what they didn't realize is this: the moment they moved against you, they lost, because you are covered, you are watched over, you are untouchable. They thought they were unseen, but forces greater than them were listening. They thought they could write your downfall, but the ink never even touched the page. And now, the shift begins. The atmosphere changes. The air gets heavier, because this is the moment where everything turns in your favor. Let them talk. Let them plan. Let them believe they hold the upper hand. It changes nothing, because the highest quality, that's you, and no one can take that away. The room itself recoiled, as if the walls knew what the people inside did not. The air thickened, pressing against their lungs, demanding reverence. Then, like a fracture in reality itself, a force unseen yet undeniable cut through the darkness, sending waves of energy through the space. What had been familiar just moments ago, dim lights, hushed whispers, the illusion of control, became foreign and insignificant. A power arrived, vast enough to unmake their resolve in an instant. It did not speak in echoes or thunder, yet its presence shattered their certainty. A command, simple yet immovable, embedded itself in their very being, searing through their arrogance like fire through brittle paper. Do not dare lay a hand. The words did not need repetition. Their meaning was final. Every carefully woven deception unraveled before their eyes, their schemes now feeble in the wake of something infinitely greater. Fear, raw and unfiltered, took hold. The space that once provided secrecy had turned into a cage, and they were its prisoners. Panic clawed at their throats as the need to escape overwhelmed all else. They bolted, their steps betraying them, their thoughts collapsing under the weight of the undeniable. If your heart overflows with God's blessings, let that love shine. Click the super thank you button and give $20 or more to plant seeds of faith that will impact countless lives. Your generosity reflects His abundance. Be a vessel of His grace and watch His kingdom flourish through you. They had moved unchecked for too long, convinced that silence was consent. Each step they took in secrecy had seemed unchallenged, their designs unfolding without resistance. But there is always a moment when patience ends. There is always a point where the unseen hand of justice moves. What they failed to realize was that they had already trespassed past that threshold. They had mistaken quiet for absence, forgetting that every whisper, every deception, every decision had been seen. And now, as they stood trembling on the wrong side of an invisible line, they understood too late that they had never been beyond consequence. What they sought to claim, what they believed they could break, was never within their grasp. The power they dismissed as intangible had been surrounding its own all along, shielding, securing, watching. They had unknowingly called forth the very thing they should have feared most. Their belief in their own dominance had been their downfall, for the moment they thought themselves untouchable was the same moment they sealed their reckoning. There would be no negotiation. A sudden shift in the air, subtle yet absolute, stole the breath from their lungs. The change did not announce itself with rage. It did not descend in fury. It arrived as something far more terrifying: finality. Their hands shook before their minds could understand why. Words, once so easily spoken, now felt like shards in their throats. The power that had entered the space required no grand display, no dramatic unveiling. It simply was, and that alone was enough to strip them of every falsehood they had built themselves upon. The arrogance that had driven them moments ago collapsed beneath the weight of something immeasurable. And then the words came, not in anger, not in threat, but in a tone that left no room for defiance. "This ends now." They had no defense against it, no rebuttal to offer. The very structure of their confidence caved, leaving them hollow. It was not fate, nor chance, nor a twist of fortune that had brought them here. They had written this moment for themselves, with every decision, every deception, every miscalculation. What they had dismissed as powerless now stood before them, irrefutable, and they were left with nothing but the undeniable truth. They had overstepped, and there would be no going back. They wanted to move, to justify, to plead, but the ability to act had been stripped from them. A force greater than words had settled over them, locking every thought, every excuse, every desperate attempt at resistance inside their own minds. There was no room for argument, no space for defiance. The verdict had been rendered, and it carried with it an understanding that was more than intellectual. It was absolute. This was not merely an opportunity to retreat. It was the final moment before all paths disappeared entirely. What had once been confidence did not simply wane. It was obliterated. Something within them cracked, something ancient, something ingrained in the deepest recesses of existence itself. It was the recognition of dominion, of an authority so complete that the body reacted before the mind could process it. This was not fear in the way they had known it before. This was a terror that reached beyond reason, beyond comprehension, beyond survival itself. One of them struggled to keep his limbs steady, but his body betrayed him with trembling hands and quivering breath. Another clenched his fists, teeth grinding together, but it did nothing to disguise the sheer dread coursing through him. Someone took a staggering step backward, as if instinct alone understood the need for distance. The loudest among them, the one whose words had once dripped with venom, tried to force himself to swallow, but the dryness in his mouth turned it into a painful effort. The air did not merely press down, it constricted, wrapping around them like an invisible chain, forcing submission. It was not heat, not suffocation, not weight in the physical sense, but something else entirely, an undeniable force that stripped them of their illusions. They had walked in as the hunters, but now they were nothing more than prey, exposed, powerless, and wholly at the mercy of what stood before them. Then, one of them collapsed, not from an impact, not from exhaustion, but as if his body had recognized something his mind refused to accept. The very concept of standing in this presence had become impossible. Another staggered, his breath hitching, his instincts screaming for escape. Though no avenue existed, a third reached blindly for the wall, fingers scraping against rough stone, desperate to anchor himself against the overwhelming magnitude of the moment. But there was no stability to be found, no corner to hide in, no whispered plans to salvage the moment. Every scheme they had so carefully laid out, every move they had orchestrated in secret, had unraveled before their very eyes. They had spent countless nights constructing a reality where they were in control, where everything bent to their will, where they dictated the rules. They had spoken of their target as if they were insignificant, as if their actions carried no weight beyond the game they believed themselves to be playing. But there was no laughter now. There were no words at all. Even the very idea of speaking had become distant, impossible. Their own bodies had turned against them, betraying the depths of their fear in ways they could not suppress. They had convinced themselves that they would face no repercussions, that their actions were invisible, that their power was absolute. But now, in the crushing silence that followed, the truth stood before them, undeniable and irreversible. What they had dismissed as powerless had unraveled their illusions in an instant, and there was no escape from what they had called upon. No weapon that is formed against thee shall prosper, and every tongue that shall rise against thee in judgment thou shalt condemn. Isaiah 54:17. It always starts the same way. The envious gather in secret, convinced they can alter what was never theirs to control. They whisper, they plot, they move in the shadows, believing their hands can rewrite the future. But destiny isn't a thing to be stolen. Favor isn't a thing to be bargained for. You don't take what was given by God. A candle doesn't fight the darkness, it simply exists, and in doing so, it overcomes. But what happens when those who love the dark try to snuff it out? They think they have control. They assume their grip is strong enough to hold back what was meant to shine. But the moment they strike, the moment they reach out, they learn a truth they were never prepared for. Light cannot be extinguished by hands that were never meant to touch it. One of them, the impulsive one, the one who always thought power belonged to those who seized it, tried to hold on to his own illusion. He clung to denial like a drowning man clutching air, desperate for something that no longer existed. His thoughts spiraled, reaching for any explanation, any excuse that could make sense of what was unfolding. This isn't real, he wanted to say. This is just fear, playing tricks on us. But fear doesn't need an invitation to be real. And the truth? The truth doesn't wait for permission to be acknowledged. It simply is. They had walked into something beyond their comprehension, something far greater than them, something that didn't bend to human will. Their entire world, the confidence they had wrapped around themselves like armor, the certainty they had spoken with, the belief that they held the upper hand, shattered in an instant. There were no more whispered conversations, no smug grins, no triumphant glances exchanged. The arrogance that once defined them had evaporated, replaced by something primal, something far more real: survival. Because this was never their battle to fight. This was never their war to win. They had mistaken silence for weakness. They had confused patience for permission. But some lines, once crossed, do not allow retreat. Some actions cannot be undone, and the cost of their mistake had already been decided. Some battles are over before they even begin. And this wasn't just a loss. This was the end of their illusion. The moment they realized they had never been in control. And now they weren't strategizing. They weren't conspiring. They weren't even thinking. They were running. Their thoughts spiraled, clawing for a way out. Would their downfall be swift, or would it stretch over time, unraveling them piece by piece? Would their names fade, their influence erased, their legacy rewritten into nothingness? The unknown yawned before them, vast and merciless, and for the first time, they feared what awaited them beyond the next breath. One of them, always the loudest, parted his lips as if to argue, as if to beg, but silence swallowed his words. Before they could be formed, his voice had been taken. his reasoning made irrelevant in the presence of something that spoke without needing to be heard. And then clarity, not in images, not in words, but in something deeper, something undeniable. They didn't just see their future, they felt it. The weight of their choices, the path they had forged, the destruction they had called upon themselves. It all became as real as the ground beneath them. This was no warning. This was an outcome already set in motion, waiting only for their final step. Stay and be consumed. Leave and pray they were still allowed to. Their bodies had already made the decision before their minds could process it. One by one, without speaking, they turned away, driven by a knowledge they could not escape. There are some forces no one can stand against. Stop. Yes, you. This isn't for everyone. Some will pass it by, unmoved, untouched. But if something inside you stirs, if something in these words pulls at your soul, then you already know this is meant for you. The ones who do not blend in, who do not submit to the expectations placed upon them. The ones who were never meant to be silent, never meant to be ordinary. There are those who follow the well-worn path, but not you. You are the fracture in the illusion, the force that does not yield, the storm that cannot be tamed. The world does not understand you because it was never meant to, but you do not exist for their comfort, for their acceptance, for their approval. You stand apart not because you choose to, but because you were made to. You are not here to fit in. You are here to rise. They broke all at once, a disjointed mass of frantic movement, tripping over themselves in their desperate need to flee. The confidence they had carried, the arrogance that had once shaped their every decision, had been ripped from them, leaving only instinct, the primal need to escape. The air still clung to them, heavy, suffocating, a reminder of what had filled that space just moments before. Some sprinted into the darkness, pushing forward without direction, driven only by the hope that distance would erase what had just happened. Others doubled over, gripping their chests, struggling against the invisible weight that refused to release them. One collapsed entirely, frozen in place, his mind unable to reconcile the reality he had just witnessed with the world he had once believed in. None of them dared to pause, dared to question, dared to look back, because whatever had stood among them was not something to be faced. It was something to be survived. And as they ran, the truth settled in, slow and suffocating. This wasn't just the failure of a scheme, not merely the collapse of a carefully crafted deception. This was something far worse. A message had been delivered, one that needed no further explanation. A few, shaken to their core, whispered words they hadn't spoken in years, reaching for the comfort of something greater than themselves, unsure if their pleas would be heard. Others, unwilling to surrender to the terror, tried to convince themselves that what they had experienced was nothing more than panic, an illusion brought on by fear. But no denial could rewrite the truth. They had stepped past the boundaries of what should have been left untouched. And worse still, they had been allowed to leave, not because they had fought, not because they had won, but because mercy had been extended. The night swallowed them whole, but the moment had etched itself into their very being, a mark that could never be erased. And no matter how far they ran, one truth would haunt them forever. They had stood against something untouchable, and they had been allowed to walk away, not as victors, but as those who had been spared. The world outside carried on, as if nothing had changed, but they knew better. Routine became a performance, a desperate attempt to reclaim the normalcy that had been ripped from them. Yet, no amount of pretending could erase the mark left upon them. What had happened that night was not a fleeting nightmare. It was a wound that refused to heal, an imprint burned too deep into their consciousness to ever fade. Sleep turned against them. Every time they closed their eyes, the memory resurfaced, not in scattered fragments, but in perfect, inescapable clarity. The unnatural stillness, the sudden shift in the atmosphere, the moment their confidence bled into horror. The voice, it didn't merely haunt their dreams, it lingered within them, woven into the very fabric of their being, an unseen weight pressing down with relentless force. Some woke gasping for air, drowning in invisible hands that refused to release them. Others stared blankly at ceilings, unwilling to surrender to sleep, knowing the moment they drifted, it would be waiting. Even in the daylight, the memory clung to them. Shadows stretched longer than before. Silence felt too thick, and an unshakable presence loomed, not menacing, not cruel, but ever watchful. They avoided one another now, the camaraderie they had once shared shattered beyond repair. The same people who had once whispered together in confidence now barely met each other's gaze. There was nothing left to say. They had all been there. They had all felt it. They all understood. Some tried to drown it out with noise, surrounding themselves with distractions, pushing music to deafening volumes, losing themselves in indulgences that numbed the edges of their thoughts. But silence had become a prison, because in the stillness, the truth always returned. The echoes of that night refused to be ignored. One of them, the proudest, the one who had always led, sat at his desk, staring at his own hands. The tremors wouldn't stop. He clenched them into fists, trying to crush the weakness out of his bones, but deep down, he understood. This was not something that could be shaken off, not something that could be reasoned away. Another, a man who had never once uttered a prayer, found himself grasping at words he did not know how to form, speaking into the void, unsure if he was even being heard. But he knew one thing. If what they had witnessed was real, then everything he had built his life upon had been a lie. They couldn't explain it. There were no rational excuses, no logical explanations to dilute what had taken place. This was not panic. It was not hysteria. It had not been an illusion. It was real. They had all felt it. They had all heard it. And the most terrifying part? They had been allowed to leave. Not because they had outmaneuvered anything, not because they had earned their escape, but because something had let them go. That knowledge settled deep, curling around their thoughts, like a warning left unspoken. And in the quiet moments when they were alone, the realization gnawed at them with merciless certainty. What had stepped in that night had ended them before they had even begun. And whatever plans they once had, they would never dare to revisit again. Not once did you have to defend yourself, yet you were guarded by a force unseen, surrounded by a barrier no scheme, no deception, no whispered conspiracy could breach. While they spent restless nights weaving their plans, the response had already been set in motion. Before they even uttered your name in secrecy, the course had been determined. They thought they were the ones in control, that they were closing in. But in truth, they had only been walking straight into a force beyond their comprehension. What they mistook for vulnerability had never been anything less than an unshakable shield, an unseen defense standing between you and their intentions. The silence they had taken as permission had never been indifference. It had been the calm before everything changed. And when the moment arrived, when they believed their plans had finally aligned, they weren't met with resistance from you. They were stopped by something far greater, something they had never accounted for. The terror that gripped them wasn't just fear of exposure, it was the weight of realization. Every hushed conversation, every step taken in secrecy, every carefully orchestrated move had been visible all along. The hidden had been laid bare, their ambitions reduced to dust beneath an unrelenting gaze. They had convinced themselves that you were their opponent, that the battle was theirs to win, but they had unknowingly stepped into a war that had never been theirs to fight. You had never been alone. You never needed to retaliate, because those who carry purpose do not walk unguarded. There are forces that stand watch, silent but immovable, shielding without recognition, intervening long before danger reaches the doorstep. Battles meant to break, you were dismantled before you even knew they existed. Threats that should have gained momentum were silenced before they could take form. No force in the seen or unseen could alter what had already been decided. They had tried, they had failed, and now they carried the weight of that failure deep within them. What they meant for your downfall only propelled you forward. They had whispered, plotted, waited for the moment when you would fall, certain that their plan would be the one to succeed. They had seen themselves victorious, imagined the sight of you diminished, believing that their hands had the power to remove you from where you stood. But what they never understood was this: nothing can dismantle what has already been set in motion. Their very obsession with your failure was proof of what you carried, confirmation of what they feared most. No one tries to destroy what is insignificant. No one fights against something that holds no value. Their desperation to see you fall was the clearest sign that you had already won, because those with no power are never a threat. And the fact that they tried so hard only proves one thing: you are unstoppable. They thought they held control, that their deception was enough to rewrite the course of events. They believed their manipulation would shift the narrative, that their betrayal would weaken you, that their efforts would turn the tide in their favor. But instead of halting your progress, they only propelled you forward. In trying to obstruct your path, they unknowingly became the very force that accelerated your rise. They sought to silence you, yet in their attempt to suppress your voice, they only made it echo louder. Their goal was to break you, but all they succeeded in doing was revealing a truth they had never considered: you cannot be broken. This is the paradox of challenging those who are called. Every attack meant to bring them down becomes the very fuel that lifts them higher. It has always worked this way. The more resistance they face, the greater their rise. The more opposition presses in, the more unstoppable they become. History has proven it time and time again. What was meant for ruin is transformed into elevation, because what is ordained cannot be undone. No force can revoke it. No betrayal can alter it. No scheme can steal it. Purpose, once set in motion, cannot be overturned by human hands. They convinced themselves they had power over your destiny, but their plans were nothing more than whispers, carried away by the wind. The truth was never in their favor. You were never the one at risk. They were. Because the moment they set themselves against you, they unknowingly opposed something far beyond their understanding. And now, as they reeled from the aftermath, you move forward, not as a casualty of their plotting, but as someone untouched by their schemes, standing in a place they could never reach. You remain unshaken. You advance with certainty, and those who once believed they could dictate your path now stand helpless, watching as their efforts crumble into nothing. Move with confidence. You are surrounded by a force that cannot be undone. Let them whisper. Let them plan. Let them work in the shadows. Convince their actions will remain hidden. It will never change what has already been written. You do not stand alone. You never have. With every step you take, with every battle you encounter, there is protection moving before you, beside you, behind you. These are not your burdens to bear, not your fights to win. What rises against you does not rise against just a person. It stands against the very force that has called you, the unshakable power that defends you. That is why their plans fail. That is why their strength crumbles. That is why, when all is said and done, you remain standing while they are left to face the wreckage of their own making. Never fear what is plotted in secrecy. Truth always comes to light, and justice never sleeps. Keep walking, keep standing, keep moving forward. No force can touch what has been sealed. No attempt against you can succeed. And let them all come to understand one thing with absolute certainty. Those who are chosen do not fall.